Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you join us today on our webinar looking at COP16 and what the outcomes of COP16 mean for business. My name is Tom Butterworth. I am the nature lead for Arup, and I'm going to be taking us through and leading us through this webinar today. Just a few housekeeping points. You'll see that you are on mute. Please do add questions to the Q&A box, and we'll look to pick those up towards the end of the session, the second half of this session. Please do add your questions throughout the session. We'll be here for about an hour today, and the session is going to be recorded, so just to make sure that you're aware of that as well. Now, I am delighted to be joined today by a couple of fantastic friends and guests. Tom Gray from the BBC as Nature Strategy Lead, and Sander Keulen from NatureMetrics, Director of Global Business Development. Now, we're going to come to both of them for some questions and discussions in a moment, but we're going to kick off by giving a short presentation just to make sure that we're all up to speed on what COP16 is, what some of the key outcomes were, and some of the key messages and takeaways from business. And then we're going to come back and have a discussion. So let's start at the beginning. COP16. This is a biodiversity convention that was kicked off in 1992 at Rio Earth Summit. The COP meets every 2 years, and you'll probably be very well aware of the climate COPs. We also have a third COP, a COP on desertification. And off the back of 92, these three meetings were set up to deal with climate, the loss of our land to desert, and biodiversity loss. And today we're talking about the biodiversity COP. 2 years ago, COP15 was held in Montreal, and off the back of that COP, we set out 23 targets. The Keulen-Montreal Biodiversity Framework to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. Now, we'll have a quick look at some of those targets, but we're not going to go into them in detail. This COP, COP16, the follow-on, was billed as an implementation COP. So the idea of taking the targets that were set out 2 years ago and setting those into action. The areas of focus were the MBSAPs, and we've got some acronyms on our screen. I'll talk through these acronyms. That's National Biodiversity Species in Action Plan. These are country level plans to embed these biodiversity targets into policy, strategy, and action at a country level. There was a whole load of focus at this COP on supporting Indigenous peoples, on looking at how we get digital sequencing information and that's genetic information that's taken to allow money to go to those places that are providing that genetic information, and also to look at how we mobilize a significant fund, the Global Biodiversity Fund, to target action into the places of highest value of biodiversity. Now, just before we get into the detail of what came out of the COP, let's just refresh our minds briefly. 2 years ago, the Global Biodiversity Framework was set with these 23 targets, focusing on conserving, avoiding, safeguarding, and acting. The targets that particularly stand out, or the ones that are most memorable, the 30 by 30 target, that's both target 2 and target 3, but particularly target 3, which is about protecting and conserving 30% of our land and sea. Target 2, which is also about 30%, is actually about restoring 30% of our degraded areas. Now, alongside that, we had, for the first time ever, some targets that were specifically focused on businesses, particularly target 15, which was around requiring businesses to monitor and disclose impacts on biodiversity. There was also a phase out of perverse subsidies that have negative impact on biodiversity. So some real important ambitions set 2 years ago. So how did we do? Where have we got to? And was this really an implementation COP? Well, the truth is that we've got mixed results here. It's been quite a challenging couple of weeks at COP for the negotiators. We've only got 44, this is at the time of recording, 44 out of the 196 countries had submitted their MBSAPs. These are these national plans. The UK, as an example, has not submitted its plan, but has said that it's got plans in place and is acting on this work already and just hasn't quite published one. Whether that's an adequate situation or not, I think we've had 2 years to get this up and running, and that's woefully behind where we wanted to be. However, there was good news in amongst what came out of COP as well. For the first time ever, and this is the first time ever, not just for a biodiversity COP, but for any UN environmental process, we've got a body that's been set up, permanent body that's been set up under Article 8J, for those that are desperately interested in that level of detail. But this body is to support the local communities and indigenous peoples. So that's the IPLC, Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, so that they have a voice to bring traditional knowledge and local knowledge into the negotiations, providing a real hotspot and key focus on that understanding from Indigenous peoples. I think that Indigenous peoples are about 5% of the world's population. At the moment, they're receiving about 1% of the funding that's going to biodiversity, and yet they look after, at the minimum, 40%, and some suggest 80% of our biodiversity globally. So a really important step forward. We actually had some really significant engagement and presence from Indigenous people at the COP, and it was really exciting to engage with a whole load of communities, bringing new ways of thinking to traditional ways of thinking, new to the COP, ways of thinking about how we look after nature. The next thing I wanted to flag is the Kali Fund. This was established to share the benefits from what's the acronym here, DSI, that's Digital Sequencing Information. This is set up to, and was agreed to set up funding moving from those businesses and organizations benefiting and profiting from genetic information back to the places where that genetic information has come from. The EU were really strong on pushing for this, and I know the UK government did a huge amount of work to push this negotiation as well, with a whole load of countries from around the world. We had significant movement forward, and this fund is now going to be set up. I think it's going to take a significant amount of time for it to be embedded in legislation and actually be enacted. But we've stepped forward on this, which is the first time this has been a discussion for a large number of years, something like 12, 13, 14 years now. So this is coming to fruition of a really significant part of the negotiations. The discussion around this, and this hasn't been set yet, but the discussion around this was something like 1% of the profits from those products that use genetic materials would go back to those local places to restore nature. We're yet to see how the detail of this, but this has been agreed and will be set up and taken forward. There was significant discussion as well on this global biodiversity front, but the COP lost quorum. People had to leave before the final agreement. The negotiations went through the night on the last night, and the morning of Saturday people had to leave, so they weren't able to get to a point of agreeing this final fund. There was broad agreement on the need to increase the funding and secure $200 billion annually by 2030 to support biodiversity, but the progress stalled. due to disagreements about the funding mechanism, about how that funding would be allocated through to the people impacting on nature, having a positive impact on nature. So some good news and some news that there's still work to be done. The last point I wanted to bring out here, which is something that hasn't seemed to make a lot of the sort of press on this, is that there were also agreements on how we report against the global biodiversity targets. And there was an agreement that the review of progress of the GBF, of the Global Biodiversity Framework, will include information from non-governmental actors. Now, I've been involved in this for a very long time. I was involved in reporting back for the government from England into this report previously. And in the past, it never included information from non-government actors. So this is the first time that NGOs, businesses, and so on will be asked to report against the global biodiversity targets to feed into those government reports. We're yet to see what that means. The CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has been asked to facilitate an informal discussion for parties and relevant actors on what this might mean, on how we might share good practice, how we might address challenges, how we might deal with gaps and solutions. So this is something that has been agreed, but the detail is yet to come through. So I think this reflects some of what I've just talked about. What does this mean for businesses? Well, I think I've started to hint at that already. We know that there's a significant challenge on the funding, the DSI requirements, the Global Biodiversity Fund, sometimes called the GEF, the Global Environmental Fund, are all about how we get money to these local groups delivering change on the ground. That setup of the body for the indigenous peoples and the local communities is again giving a voice to how we get the delivery on the ground. This is a really important piece of the negotiations, and it was why these negotiations were so challenging. Private sector makes up something like 80% of the global GDP, and there were more businesses at this COP than ever before. 3,000 businesses, separate businesses at this COP. I think if we go back to Montreal, it was at half that number. If we go back to the COP before that, it was something like 500. It may have been even less 2 years ago. So we are seeing exponential growth in the bubble, in the group of businesses that are engaging with this, and a wider group as well. Significant engagement from finance, from banks, as well as some of the organizations, wider private sector businesses. And the discussions focused heavily on how we de-risk the finance, how we set up nature markets, how we build biodiversity credits, how we understand the business risk and nature and dependencies on nature. And understanding those risks and dependencies comes back to that requirement on target 15 I mentioned earlier around disclosing impacts on nature. And it may well play out in this new ambition for businesses and NGOs to report against the Global Biodiversity Framework as well. So how do we let that money flow through to the local communities, to the indigenous peoples, to protect biodiversity? Business has a critical role in this. And when governments are rather slow to set up their MBSAPs, my personal view is that businesses have an opportunity to step forward and show what good looks like. Now, we're going to come to our discussion. I want to open this up to our panelists, and we're going to open up with some questions to our panelists, but I'm going to start by asking them to do a little bit of a better job on introducing themselves to the audience. So, Tom, may I pass to you first to introduce yourself and your role?
Yeah, you may. Thanks, all. My name is Tom Gray. I work for the BBC Group as their nature lead. I've been in the role about 6 months, but it's a brand new role. Didn't exist before I joined, so it's a pretty interesting place to be. My main role is looking at the BBC's overall footprint, thinking about how the decisions that we make do have an impact on the environment and where they have that in the world. Also looking at some of our output, at the impact of our productions, and also thinking about how, we've got over 200 buildings, how we can improve them for biodiversity as well, both for the benefit of the people who work at the BBC and the local communities.
Thank you, Tom. Sander.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, my name is Sander Keulen. I'm Dutch. By the last name, you can probably figure that out. I live near Amsterdam, and I'm the global director of global business development at NatureMetrics. NatureMetrics, for those who don't know, is a company that supports companies in their way to become nature positive or net positive. We support companies with tools, but also with measuring nature on sites, specifically using environmental DNA. And for those who are never heard of environmental DNA, they think, what is this? It's really easy. A 10-second course here follows now. All living animals shed cells all the way through, mucus, sweat, hair, feces, urine, you name it. And so all these animals, they leave tiny traces of DNA behind. And this DNA stays around on soil, in water for about 24 to 48 hours. And so if we take samples of that specific site location through soil samples or water samples, we can analyze and detect all the species that were present at the time we took the sample. And so it gives us a very nice view of the state of nature in a particular area, if you like. It could be marine, aquatic, riversides, ponds, but also soil, and a large forest, for example. This gives companies a little bit of insight in what's happening on their locations. And so we map that, we report this back, and it allows companies to disclose this information into the annual reports or into TNFD or CSRD reporting. I'll leave it at that, but so that's more or less my story here.
Thank you, Sander, and thank you so much for that introduction to eDNA as well. It's really fascinating to see the technology moving so quickly. And I'm going to start with you, Tom. From the BBC's perspective, what was the strategic importance of your organisation attending COP? So why were you there? What was important for you?
Why were you here? Great question. I should also clarify, the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, that in case those that don't know, we make a few programs that are broadcast globally. And it's, why would we want to be there? It's a great question. We recognise that there's very few opportunities when there's such gigantic comings together of individuals operating in this space. The opportunities to go and learn from and with other people in this space just don't exist quite at that scale. One thing that kind of struck me, particularly from Montreal, actually, it was the first time that I'd ever sat down to learn about a new aspect of the nature business. But in the same room, there were people from probably 30, 40 countries, but 196 countries. Well, I think even though the USA wasn't there officially as a delegate, they still had representatives there, right? So more people from all of these countries there, and indigenous people there as well. It's really important to go to these places and show what we're doing as an organization, but also learn from the best that science and indigenous communities have to offer. That opportunity simply doesn't exist without being there. On the other side of this as well, the BBC has a reputation for creating some of, I don't know, you could argue this, but I think some of the best wildlife and climate related documentaries in the world. I don't think any other organization quite has the same history as the wider BBC does. A 60-year history of tracking and illustrating the impacts of people's actions on the climate and on biodiversity. Reputationally, it's huge for us our reputation is predicated on making these brilliant documentaries. And so we wanted to be there to make sure that we were learning from the best in the world. And the other thing that we were there for actually was to host an event around the power of storytelling. We kind of recognize that particularly at COP15, there's a lot of businesses going there to talk about what they're doing and selling products and also seeking to learn themselves. But one of the things we really wanted to do was bring the cohort of people operating in the media space together to have a discussion about the best ways to reach people too. And again, accessing that global cohort all in one place and being able to have those discussions, it's practically impossible outside of events like this. So it was really important for us to be there and also just represent the organization and show what we can do.
And what was your reflections coming away from COP, Tom? Did you feel that you got what you wanted out of it? What was missing from the negotiations or from the discussions?
I think you've already covered what was missing from the negotiations, particularly with regards to firm conclusions on a number of topics. And I'm not going to put myself in a position where I'm criticising any single or aggregate group of governments, but I think from any delegate's perspective, it was quite disappointing that things ran through the night on the last day and were ended due to lack of quorum as opposed to a whole-scale disagreement, right? You could understand if countries went blow for blow and didn't quite reach an agreement, but time being the factor is really painful. And there's a lot of criticism that I've read in the press that perhaps agreement should have been reached pre-COP, like they had been at COP15 and like they have been at COP29. They've already hit the ground running, according to the news this morning. Apparently, negotiations went quite late last night, which tends to only really happen later into the second week, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a disappointment. But the real positives were, again, as you've already illustrated, I think that the agreement for the indigenous people and local communities is fantastic. And it was something that was brought into such sharp, incredible focus at COP15. It's brilliant that they've come to an agreement on that. The agreement around digital sequencing of information and equitable benefit sharing is huge, because there was so much made in the press beforehand about how lots of companies wouldn't accept this, but the governments were brave enough to do it. And I know that certain aspects of the funding is going to be voluntary, but it's still a fantastic achievement. But from our company perspective, yes, we hosted an event with between 200 and 250 people, we're told, joined in the room. We were able to bring a whole community together of people who were operating in the space who otherwise felt that their careers had been underrepresented in the array of events within the Blue Zone at COP, and had some fantastic discussions around the best way to approach storytelling and the creation of nature-focused documentaries, for instance, or how to access the best pictures, the best footage, the best talent, really, in this space. I don't operate in the creative space with particularly, I don't work for the Natural History Unit that makes a lot of the Planet Earth style documentaries. I work in the corporate elements of the BBC, but understanding what people's priorities were has been fun. It was a fantastic experience for us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I'm going to come back to your organisation and what the next steps you're taking in a moment, but I want to bring in Sander. Now, NatureMetrics have been to a number of COPs. I was with you at the previous one, and I know that you have attended some of the others as well, and some of the climate weeks in New York and so on. What was particularly important about this COP from your point of view, Sander?
Yeah, what we noticed here, well, first of all, let me start off by saying that we wanted to go to listen and learn, to really get a good lay of the land of where we are on a global level with progress around nature restoration, nature conservation, because we feel it's of the highest importance that we make strides towards, becoming net positive. And so we went there to learn and to look, and what we noticed is quite interesting. I think, as you mentioned before, Tom, so eloquently, the last COP we had about, I think, 1,100 corporates. This time it was 300% more. So really, we're looking at a huge increase of corporates attending, which means that it is happening. So there is a movement taking place that people really start to seek to understand this whole nature thing. Right. And that's really what we heard from a lot of corporates. They came to us and said, it's fascinating what you guys do. And we really want to start working with and on nature, but we don't know how. And that was a question that we heard quite a bit. And so there's lot of companies, and I'm sure you can attest to this, Tom, that really have, nature embedded in their core strategies going forward. But there's also quite a lot of companies that came there for the first time, and they were really just there to kind of learn and absorb and getting laid over the land themselves. And so I thought that was really fascinating. What also really struck me is that the title Nature Lead, and Tom Gray, that's in one of your titles as well there at the BBC, are increasingly at an accelerating pace. So really this whole embedding of nature within an organization, giving it a title, giving it a function, and having people actually specialized in this topic for a company is really important. So those are really a few things that we noticed. COP15, indeed, as you mentioned, was about target setting and about the framework, and COP16 was really action. And what we tried to do is to show the capabilities and the data and technology that we have. Yes, you can measure nature. Yes, the tools are there, the data is there. There's actually no excuse why not to proceed and just go at it, go do it. And so that is some of the things that we took away.
There was a significant discussion on metrics. The Nature Positive Initiative have a consultation that I think is shortly closing on the metrics that could be used to assess change for biodiversity. And we also had some significant publications on biodiversity credits. Sander, from your point of view, from your organization's point of view, what's the biggest challenge that your clients are facing in integrating biodiversity metrics into their sustainability strategies?
There's, I think, a few elements, but I think first, a lot of companies are not there yet with implementing this data and these metrics. I think they need to first take a step back and really look at, the frameworks that are out there, be it regulatory or mandatory, like CSRD, the ESRS E4, of course, and ESRS E3 on water.
Let me just clarify that. That's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe that's requiring businesses to disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature, both on site and across their value chain when it's material. And the E4 was the standard that sits underneath that sets out what you actually have to disclose. Sorry, Sander.
No, exactly. And thanks for filling that in. That's wonderful. And of course, there's the TNFD, which is the Task Force for Finance-related nature risk, or nature-related financial risk, I should say. That's actually a very nice framework, and it guides companies through what they call a LEAP process, where you actually very pragmatically, step by step, have your company develop a map of where the risk, where the opportunities, where the dependencies, where the impact lies of your company on nature throughout your whole value chain, your whole supply chain, which is really nice. We noticed that companies are starting to engage with these tools and are trying to dip their toe in the water, as it like, and some of them are ready and really, really far advanced. But what we noticed most is that those companies that have a high interest are, of course, those companies that have supply chains that are now really at risk. And so if you look at the companies that supply clothing, for example, so cotton, but also the agricultural companies, the Unilevers, the Nestlés of this world, we had tons of discussions with them, and they're saying, really worried about, yield dropping on some of these products that they have because of climate change and because of nature-related risks. And so they are really already starting to take strides towards, like, how can we improve? What can we do to, if you apply the mitigation hierarchy, avoid some of these products, avoid, deforestation, then look at, repair, restore, and ultimately, consider maybe then as a last resort, some offsetting using the biodiversity credits, which is a whole new chapter, and probably could spend a whole new webinar on that, discussing that the whole thing. But I think what companies need to do first is just start look at avoiding, any action that might result into nature destruction or damage to nature. So the do no harm principle applies there. So those things are really picked up on, and I think agriculture is a huge market just waiting to happen that is going to transform and going to basically going to have to, embrace nature as part of their core strategy going forward.
That's really interesting. One of the questions that I was mulling was why so many businesses were engaging. And I think this understanding of the risks is part of that. Regulation is obviously driving that too. And we've got that regulation that you just mentioned in Europe. Disclosures, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, and then how that's playing out at a more local level. And just to be clear, that disclosure requirement is coming under that Target 15 we talked about earlier. That's also now embedded in GRI standards. It's also embedded in, it's starting to be embedded in or explored in the ISSB standards. So all of these global standards that set out reporting for companies are starting to add this disclosure piece in. And then the financial opportunities is actually the other piece that people were there for, I think. There's these markets and that offset that you mentioned in the biodiversity credits. That launch of that biodiversity credit work from the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits was very clear. It actually said there isn't a global market for biodiversity in the same way that carbon is, but there is a local market. And I just wanted to draw out one point. You mentioned this is really clear for a lot of agricultural sector. We're finding in our business now that lots of organizations are starting to identify the risks associated with nature. And Tom, I want to come to you with this in a moment, but just to give an example before I do, we're looking at things like brick supply, let's say, for building houses or building whatever we might want to build out of these bricks. And key to that is the water supply that's associated with the brick production. And the water supply is linked to and a core part of nature, both in terms of the water needed for nature, but also how that water, that ecosystem, supports that flow of water through that system. Meaning that the people building those buildings need to be thinking about the brick supplier and their water supply if they want that consistency of supply. So it's not just agriculture, it's playing out in multiple spaces. This, for me, is where I see that funding going through. So I talked about 80% of the GDP globally is from private sector. There's a huge opportunity to de-risk our businesses, to make our businesses more resilient by looking at that supply chain and the value chain and starting to identify where those risks are, where those dependencies are, and put in actions that means that money is going through to those local spaces where those resources are being drawn from to deliver positive outcomes for nature, positive outcomes for the business. That, for me, is the key takeaway that I took from the COP. There's a massive interest in this. This is now starting to become mainstream. We're starting to see this being picked up, of course, across Europe with this requirement, but also starting to see this in India, in China, in Japan, and so on. Tom, I know you've been looking at some work within the BBC on your impacts, both on-site and upstream. Would you like to say a little bit more about that and what you're finding from that and the challenges that you're finding and trying to address?
Yeah, that's fine. And my view is that this is, a lot of people are coming through and a lot of businesses are trying to take this more seriously now. But one of the biggest things that I believe is holding them back is that, yes, a lot of companies do have people who are calling themselves nature lead or have been anointed as such, and that's great. And a lot of the people who are doing that are coming from areas where they've had vast experience in biodiversity or nature or some element of interactions between businesses and ecosystems. And I think that's great. But a lot of companies are also just they're not bringing in those skills, and I think that is going to hinder efforts later down the line. If somebody who I think that we need to kind of respect the fact that nature and biodiversity are quite technical topics, and that those skills do need to be integrated into these organizations. Just one thing I wrote down, Tom, while you were talking, yes, Target 15 relates to disclosures. And one quote that I heard at COP, which was quite concerning to me, was a a large corporate, a fairly senior person in a large corporate said, it's easy. We just have to worry about target 15. You don't have to worry about any of the other targets of the GBF, as though disclosures is the only thing that a company can influence. And I think that comes from a place of, and ignorance isn't a dirty word. We're all ignorant about plenty, but it comes from a place of not having integrated biodiversity expertise into their organization. So all they can see is disclosure legislation coming down the track. And I think that's something that we should, I mean, maybe we can unpick it in this conversation, but I think it's really important that businesses integrate real biodiversity expertise into their organizations, as opposed to relying on somebody pivoting over on a weekend course on nature.
Yeah, Arup wouldn't want me to design a bridge. I'm not a bridge engineer. So we need bridge engineers to design bridges, don't we? Yeah. And exactly the same is true for looking after and thinking about ecosystem and nature. We need the experts in ecology, exactly, and water, and so on. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'll step down off my soapbox for a moment and answer your actual question, which I think it was a long time ago, related to TNFD and some of the issues that we're finding, or challenges or fun things we're finding. The BBC is an early adopter of TNFD. I think they signed up to it. I say they because they signed up to it just before I started. But we, as an organisation, recognise the value in doing this. We, like I said earlier about the reputation, we want to make sure that our actions that we take as an organisation are not incongruent with the output that we create. And that's so understanding that our dependencies on nature, where we might be impacting nature through our global supply chain, very important for us to do. The way we're looking at it, though, is that we're trying to, we've run a biodiversity footprinting exercise with the University of Oxford, and we're trying to come up with a figure of what our biodiversity footprint is and where in the world, but using our scope 3, a phrase that I really dislike, but some of our carbon data as a proxy. And that's great. It's revealed to us a lot of information about the impacts that we might be having and where we might be having them. But for us, we want to understand our geographical impacts. I want to be able to, as you've said, bricks, real problem. Anything in the construction industry is a problem. Where does the sand that goes into your concrete come from? Don't know. But for our supply chains, what we want to do is make sure that we understand our dependencies on ecosystems and where those are in the world. And if we identify that we are operating in a space of ecological fragility or water scarcity, for instance, that we're able to work with our suppliers and transform those operations, or halt operations that are damaging the environment. And that, ideally those two, rather than divesting entirely, because we know that if we find something that's damaging to the environment and we withdraw from that, someone else is just going to fill that gap. So it's much more important for us to think, how can we work with our suppliers so that they're working in a way that works for us, that actually benefits the environment? That's what we're looking at. And the problems, I suppose, look, I don't get into this idea that, we don't have enough data to do anything. A lot of companies are afraid to start, which is where companies like NatureMetrics come in, because you guys create a hell of a lot of data, and I'm a big fan. That's not an endorsement, but I think a lot of companies just need to get started. I think this is the big thing for us is we didn't need a raft of data to kind of start thinking about where our impacts might be. We can use the TNFD and some of the stuff that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has produced. Brilliant roadmaps to Nature Positive, by the way, that apply to so many companies in this sector. They give a really good start about how you might want to start thinking about where your impacts might vest. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at where our biggest risks and dependencies might be. And then I don't know if you want me to name them, Tom, but we are working with a relatively reasonable consultant on helping us to identify for, I think, 3 of our highest impact areas, or highest risk areas at least, where our supply chain impacts do vest. We're looking at that right now. But we're very early on in that process, and I couldn't possibly report any results. But
yeah, no, well, we'll come back and hear results later, Tom, when we've got that detail. But thank you for that. I think that's really interesting. I think this point of where to start is really critical, because it can feel a little bit overwhelming, and just the number of acronyms that we use is challenging. I know we've had a question on what NBSAP stands for, and my apologies, I didn't say National Biodiversity and Species Action Plan. So these are the plans that the governments have got to set out, and that's where we'll see business particularly referenced for the first time, we think, in terms of how we take this forward. And Tom's absolutely right. We can, as businesses, we can engage in all of these targets and think about how we contribute to them. One of the key things we need to be able to understand is how we assess that risk on the ground, how we understand what's happening in those locations. Sana, I wonder whether you might like to give an example of where you've worked with companies to help understand that and some of the outcomes that you've seen.
Yeah, thanks. And this also goes back to what Tom Gray was saying. I think that a lot of issues that companies currently have is actually having a good view of their whole supply chain and where all the stuff that they source comes from. Most companies, strikingly enough, even food companies, don't really know. And they say, well, we get it from somebody in India. And where did they source it? Well, we don't know. And so just by starting to look at, okay, let's start mapping all your dependencies and all your impacts first and really have a good view there and then take it from there. I think that would be, for many companies already, would provide them a ton of insights that not only would lead to identifying some risks, but also identifying quite a few opportunities where they could actually do things better and they could actually potentially even gain a competitive advantage by maybe even changing countries, changing supply chains for certain products and certain product lines. So we work with companies that actually have these needs, and we all know that there's lots of data out there already, spatial data, modeled data, if you like. That's what we call it. And by starting to pinpoint all your locations on a map, and then overlaying all these risk layers, flood, climate risk, but also layers that are existing, the IBAT, for example, which measures your relationship to key biosensitive areas. If you start mapping that already, and that any company can do this, if they put a resource to this, it's a really easy start to just get grips with nature and where you are, where your interface with nature is. And then take it one step further. You look at those areas that are really critical, that are material to nature and actually pose quite some risk and large impact. And then you drill down, and that's where then eDNA could come to the forefront and say, now let's take specific samples in the locations, really measuring the state of nature in those areas, and start mapping if you're dealing with maybe IUCN threatened species, red list species, for example, or maybe identify invasive species that you may have in your locations, and then start developing action plans on working with those and mitigating your risk in those areas. And so slowly you see it's a funnel effect, right? So you start mapping all your locations, you drill down, you overlay all your risk layers, and then eventually you take some ground truth data where eDNA could play a role, but also bioacoustics or camera traps or whatnot. And so that really can then start building a picture of what does my ecosystem look like? Because that's really what it's all about, isn't it? It's the health of the ecosystem that gives us the services that we then benefit from in return. And it's not so much about the tree and the plant and the ant. It's more about the whole thing together. Is that in a healthy state? And will that then be resilient enough going forward for our particular company to continue to provide those services that we currently profit from? And so that's actually the baseline in the story.
This can feel quite overwhelming when we step into this space to start. And firstly, that's completely understandable. I think that's important to recognise. What I'd like to draw out in our last little while is what are the first easy steps we might take? What would we be advising businesses if we were coming in? Tom, you've come new into the BBC, but I know the BBC have been doing lots on this for a while. But what's the first step that we should be taking, if there is one?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the BBC's had a sustainability director for 3 or 4 years now, and they've been doing net zero and carbon work for quite some time. It's only in the last year or so that considerations around biodiversity and nature have really come to the fore in the discussion, as opposed to just being a constituent element. And it's really positive that the organisation's taking that step. I say self-servingly, but I think I actually think Sander answered it pretty well earlier, that it's just a matter of, that there's a lot of data out there that you can start looking at now. And I think if I would advise that organizations do either bring in full-time or part-time or consultancy-based expertise from the nature world, just to help them in the early stages. There's a very simple thing with TNFD. It's called the LEAP process. Again, Sander's already mentioned it, but it's I say simple. The first step of it is looking at effectively a matrixed approach to the potential impacts that you might have through your supply chain. There are huge numbers of freely available tools online that will help you consider what impacts your business might have and the risk and the magnitude of those potential impacts depending on where they are in the world, or very specifically within individual geographies. And I think that's something that every organization probably could do as a first step. But realistically, not because I want to endorse any particular organization, but Business for Nature is a place I would start. I would look at the Business for Nature, and I'm sure the UK Business Biodiversity Forum and World Business Council for Sustainable Development have equally good materials, but Business for Nature isn't a membership-based organization. They have a lot of information out there on how companies can start to think about their nature positive journey. And look, the simplest steps, again, Sander's laid them out. Just think about it. Just look at, start digging into your supply chain and look at that globally available data set that's already the data sets that are already out there, and start considering where you might be having an impact. These tools will help you. Like I said, there's roadmaps for nature positive for lots and lots of different different industries available out there to support you. And I really think that once you scratch beneath the surface, that does sometimes feel kind of impenetrable, particularly with the language used. There's so many acronyms. I thought it was going to be a 3-letter acronym soup, but we're now, we've gone past 4-letter acronyms and we're in bloody 5-letter acronym territory now, and it's too much. But don't be intimidated. It's actually all pretty straightforward. It's and you'll get there. I think for us, what we did was like I said, we worked with an academic organization to help us effectively visualize the problem in a simple way. Yes, the data that underlies it is complicated, and do not ask me to describe how the University of Oxford developed our biodiversity footprint, but the numbers and the descriptions that come from it are relatively straightforward and simple, and gave us a really simple way of having those conversations with our leadership within the organization and making it real to them, because that's what this is all about. Using language that is common and making sure that people understand it, which is why I kind of expressed distaste for some of the scope 3 language earlier. I think carbon has got very complicated and esoteric and disconnected from normal vernacular in a way. And I think that we have an opportunity with biodiversity and nature to keep it simple, right? Keep it simple so that businesses and any individual within a business can quite quickly understand what we mean by ecological restoration or regeneration, for instance. Let's not get bogged down in too much terminology, but keep it simple so that everybody can understand how they're contributing to it. And
sorry,
no,
just to draw out one point that we've mentioned a couple of times, we've talked about the LEAP process. So that is within this Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, and it's locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So that's the steps that you take. You first locate where your impacts and dependencies are and evaluate them, and then assess and prepare the actions that you might take. And you don't have to do it all. The idea is that you focus on those where there's highest risk and highest dependency. But I want to draw us even further back to even simpler, because there's a really interesting question that's come through from the chat, which I'm going to use as a way of answering the question I've asked you both as well about the priorities. But with many competing priorities within a business, how do we prioritize nature from that long list? And so my first step is actually to say, well, what existing commitments have we got? So when I'm asked to set up a business plan to set out why nature is important, I actually step back from that and say, well, what are your carbon commitments? What are the social commitments you're making? Whether that be on your own sites where you're working, whether those be your offices or your facilities or locations where you're selling your products, what commitments have you already made? Because it's very likely that nature will interact with those commitments. If you've got carbon commitments, we will not be able to deliver them without thinking about nature. And I don't mean planting a whole load of trees to provide some offset compensation. I mean looking after the existing areas of nature. I've done a whole load of carbon assessments for different organizations, and you look at all the different actions you can take to decarbonize. And if there's any land within that portfolio, one of the key things that must be done is to make sure that you're not losing more carbon from that land.
Yep.
Yeah. So at the moment, a lot of our agricultural land is releasing carbon into the atmosphere. We need to look at how we manage land, how we farm, how we look after land, so that we're not releasing that carbon. If we get that right, that can be fantastic for biodiversity as well. And so for me, the first step is actually, well, what are our existing commitments? And how are we going to deliver those? What have we already said that we're going to do? And where does that interface with nature?
Yeah.
And then beyond that, we can say, well, where's our existing footprint? Where's our direct footprint of our work right now, our offices, our facilities, and so on? Let's have a look at that. And then we can build out from that. And we've done that. That's something that I know the BBC have done as well. Looked at your own facilities, your own offices and locations, and then start thinking about the supply chain. So we do the easy bit first. It's not necessarily the most important from a biodiversity point of view. Something up the supply chain may be more important, but we can bite off that easy piece first. And I think that's there's no shame in doing that. It's a good first step. But we've also got another COP starting right at the minute, a climate COP. And Sandra, I wonder whether both are your organisation going to be there, and what's the relevance of these two COPs, and how do they interrelate or not? Where do you think we go from how do we build these interrelationships between nature and climate?
It's a really good question, Tom. And you actually mentioned it already yourself a little bit, is that nature and climate are so interlinked. You cannot solve one without solving the other, right? And so if we continue deforestation as we are to date, right? Every minute we lose 32 hectares of forest globally, net. And so these numbers are crazy. And so as long as we're just not restoring nature, putting back those barriers for climate change, then climate change will just accelerate and get out of hand. So what I've heard at COP16 in Cali is that there is a need for the two COPs to be more interlinked and increase the collaboration between the two. And I think that's a really good and important point. It's really a little bit awkward that we have a biodiversity COP every 2 years and we have a climate COP every year, and we're not connecting the two. And I feel that there's a need to connect and to move progress together. And everybody now, after many decades of debating carbon, we all now start to recognize, hey, climate change is happening and it's happening fast, and let's take action, albeit, action might be a bit slow still. But I think, for nature, we need to move fast. And so I only can see one path forward is that, we start, collaborating a bit more with Climate COP. By the way, we're not going to be present there. We did enough work in Cali, and we voiced our opinions and participated in wonderful forums and had wonderful breakfasts with many parties. And I think we're now just going to do the work.
Very good, very good. And I know that COP30 in Brazil, so the climate COP30 in Brazil, is looking specifically at how nature and climate come together. So it might be that, that's another opportunity. I think the other piece that's striking for me is that we shouldn't just assume that the biodiversity COP just goes quiet now for 2 years and disappears. There's a whole load of intersessional meetings. There's a whole load of work that governments will do to take this and take it forward. So it's not sort of stopped. This is always a work in progress. And that's going to lead to regulations coming through. We're seeing them coming through in Europe. We're expecting more elsewhere. We've just seen the MB SAP, that plan coming from India. With these numerous emerging regulations on nature and biodiversity, what strategies would you advise, Tom? What strategies are you taking within the BBC to help stay proactive, maintain the cutting edge of this? What would you recommend others pick up and take forward?
I mean, it really depends on where you are on your journey and what expertise you have in-house. But for me, it's just giving it a go. You've got to start somewhere. And I think one point that you made that I'm just going to say again, because I think it's really important to illustrate to people who might feel intimidated by this process, is that when you start looking at your nature-related risks and dependencies, it doesn't require you to address every single one. The idea of TNFD and the process that you follow is to identify your highest risks, the areas that you might have the largest magnitude of impact on nature in the highest risk areas, for instance, and then address those first, prioritizing actions. So I would advise people to look at the TNFD process and see if it might apply to you now, or if disclosure is becoming mandated in future, if it might. And if not, then look at the roadmaps to Nature Positive. There's also the Nature Positive initiative that you could look at too. Again, lots of free materials that are designed very specifically to help you navigate the acronym soup that we've got and start your journey. And so I don't know if it answers your question, but because it doesn't give a specific, but I think the most important thing is just to take that first step and start really just mapping where your risks might be. And look, the strength of TNFD and like the Science Based Targets Network and all these other networks that exist, and Business and Biodiversity Forums, for instance, are that they offer great places for open discussion. The point of a lot of these organizations is to allow companies to ask questions that you might think are not particularly clever, but the whole point is everybody's on a journey here, right? So, and they're also open forums for sharing things that haven't worked so well, so that other organizations don't fall into the same traps. So I would start engaging far and wide and really start considering how your organization might impact nature. I think once you start on it, it's a lot less complex than you might think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap up here. I would love to carry on this discussion. We've heard a lot about the work that's going on. Thank you so much, Tom from the BBC, Sander from NatureMetrics. It's been a pleasure to have you here. I just want to reflect on that last point before we close. My reflection on working in this industry over the last 25 something years is that there is an incredible positive goodwill towards taking action forward. This is not about pointing fingers and challenging. This is about us working together to address these issues. And the feeling at COP, even though the negotiations were really tough, was incredibly positive, incredibly engaged, very lively, lots of salsa dancing. And all I can say is do take that opportunity, reach out. There will be people to support you taking these first steps, even if they're tiny steps. It's a really exciting and positive journey to be taking. Thank you so much to our speakers. Lovely to be here with you today. And thank you to everybody who's been listening, wherever you might be.